This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com.
Okay, and we are live.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Cello Chat. I'm glad to be back after a year and a half. So as you saw in the announcement of the chat, I thought it might be interesting for you to hear a little bit about my formative years. I was fortunate enough to study with some of the great legends of the 20th century, and I owe everything to them. So, as you know, I'm artistic director of Cello Bello, and if you look at the legacy area of the website, you will also see that when I started Cello Bello some 11 years ago, I thought, I just can't go out there and pretend I just know all this stuff. I really need to do homage to my teachers and the people that gave me the knowledge and the values that I have. So that's why I created a legacy section on the website, and you will see that the people on that website basically were my teachers when I was growing up. Since that time, we've gone forward with a couple of others, Pablo Casals and Emmanuel Feuermann particularly. I'm going to talk about Casals today because I was fortunate to play in a master class for him and to attend the Marlborough Festival 3 years while he was there. He gave master classes at Marlborough and conducted the Marlborough Festival Orchestra, and I played in the cello section. So I feel like I had a pretty good dose of Pablo Casals also, but he was never a steady teacher of mine, as were the others. So Feuermann and Casals are added to the legacy site, and we've got a long string of cellists that deserve to be there and plans to put them up that don't have anything to do with me at this point. They're just cello legacy. But all we need is staff and budget to do it. Anyway, where should I start? I know you all want to hear about the immortal names, but I actually want to start just for a couple of seconds to talk about two of my earliest teachers. I think probably many of you know the name Victor César. Hold on. This is his book. I wrote a foreword for it at least 20 years ago. Vic, I was just a kid. You know that I grew up in Compton, California, a town that has some notoriety and not known for a lot of classical music, but I loved my time there. I had an inspirational high school music teacher. I had wonderful friends of all races. My parents moved there on purpose because they wanted me to grow up without prejudice. And they picked a wonderful town where I went to high school with blacks, Latinos, Asians, Jews, everybody. There wasn't a lot of classical music, but that's okay. I got other values there, and I loved my time there. And there was somebody down the street who I did some babysitting for. I don't even remember anymore how that happened, but that turned out to be Victor César's children. And I found out after I was babysitting that he was a cellist. And so as a senior in high school, he helped me prepare for my college auditions, and I just owe him a lot. I just wanted to tell you, I want to give his book a plug. You can buy it on the Cello Bello store. I put it up because I think it's a very brilliant book. Vic is a brilliant pedagogue. He was an original thinker then and not shy about challenging traditional approaches. Made me think even as a 15-year-old. And he's a kind, warm human being. And he had been a student of Leonard Rose. And so he had great bow arm and shifting suggestions for me. And he was the first one that got me thinking about long end pins and short end pins. And I'm going to plug his book once more because I think this book, which really tunes you into body awareness, a lot of exercises, breathing exercises, motion exercises, some with the cello, some without, that are very insightful. And anyway, he helped me a lot. I then went to University of Southern California, where I studied with Gabor Rejto, Rejto, for my first 3 years. Again, people a little closer to my generation are going to know that name. He was a very, very important cello teacher in the 60s and 70s. Rejto was Hungarian. He had come to this country and I think taught at Eastman and Manhattan School briefly before coming to Los Angeles to USC. And he was a really poetic artist. He was a very inspirational player. He was not a big player. I just remember his sound as being exquisite. He played with a high right arm, when I started studying with him, I was 16 years old, and he just imbued in me musical values, which I take to these days. It's not that he didn't teach technique. He certainly did. He played scales, arpeggios, octaves, Popper and Piatti etudes every day, but and he talked about bowing and shifting principles. But what I really feel that I got from, I remember as a kid, I guess I felt, I wish I had more technique. And I didn't actually feel like I was getting that from him. And it's not that he didn't teach it. I think the kind of technique that he taught was not really right for me, which is one of those things that I like to tell my students, actually. Not everything that we learn from a teacher is right for them. It's a reason that I think it's good to study with more than one teacher. I think it's good to have a teacher that you can talk to and tell them when it doesn't feel good. I hope my students today feel that if it doesn't feel good, that they can say it to me, and I'll work with them on it. Or sometimes I give them an alternative. But basically, there were two things from Rejto, who I owe a lot as a musician. There were two things that he taught that I wound up discarding. One is, there's two ways to configure the hand, the left hand. One is squared off like this, and the other is angled like this. Rejto played squared off. There are great cellists that play squared off. It's not that one way is superior to the other. Pablo Casals also played squared off. But I just remember in those days that my vibrato always felt kind of slow and wobbly. And later on, I'll get to Bernie Greenhouse. But when I went to Greenhouse suggested that I try a slanted position like this. And just going from this to this immediately increased the pulsation of the vibrato. It's a naturally faster vibrato. So I actually teach both. I learned that. Most of the time I'm teaching this slanted position, but if somebody has a machine gun vibrato that doesn't want to slow down, I very often will suggest that they try a squared off position because the natural oscillation is going to be a little bit slower. And the other thing that Righto that I never really took to was this kind of high wrist, which was very Hungarian at the time. I got more of that later on from János Starker as well. I never took to it too well. In fact, I remember as a kid growing up, not just Righto, but all of my teachers used to tell me, Paul, don't move your fingers around so much, you know. Luis Claret, my good friend and colleague at NEC, he always, when he sees that, he will always say, too much mayonnaise. I love that expression. So, but I was 18, 19 years old, and I was in love with the cello, and I was in love with music, and I simply could not stop this. So when I get to Leonard Rose, Rose was the one that organized that for me. Okay, so let me put this back down. So, as good fortune would have it, I studied with Gabor Righto for 3 years, and in my fourth year, when I was a senior at University of Southern California, Righto took a sabbatical. He was gone for a year, and the stars were aligned, and guess what? That was the year that Heifetz, Piatigorsky, and Primrose joined the USC faculty. So I auditioned for the very first Piatigorsky master class, and that was I guess that was 1961. And I got into the class, and so that began one of the most, wait a minute, I'm just sorry, give me 1 second here, I kind of messed up my keyboard. Yeah, that kind of opened up an entirely new world for me. Piatigorsky, of course, was one of the great legends of the cello, and he hadn't done a lot of teaching. He had been on the Curtis faculty, but I'm not sure how old he would have been. I think he might not, I thought of him as an old man. Here I am at almost 81, telling you that Piatigorsky struck me as an old man when he was probably 59 or 60 years old at that point. I think he was born in 1903, and this was 1961. Yes, so my God, he wasn't even 60 years old yet. Anyway, Piatigorsky was just larger than life, and he didn't believe in teaching privately. He only taught studio classes. So I cannot tell you the impact that this teaching approach had on my life and my playing. In fact, I'm sure my students of today will tell you of all of my teachers that Gregor Piatigorsky is the person that I quote the most often. Probably because he was so colorful, for one thing, so memorable. But the Piatigorsky class met Mondays and Thursdays from 10 in the morning till around 3 in the afternoon whenever we finished. So it was a 5-hour class. We all brought our lunches, brown bagged it, sat there, and one by one we would get up and play for Piatigorsky. And he regaled us with stories, maybe a good number of them he was making up at the moment, I don't know. But he was an entertainer, and all of his stories had a point. They had a purpose. They had something instructive about the cello, or some kind of moral kind of consequence that he wanted to impress upon us. So what Piatigorsky cared about more than anything was he wanted to help everybody find their own personality and be strong communicators. Just thinking back to when I was 19 years old, I actually didn't think I was a very good cellist. Maybe I played better than I thought I did, because I did have a certain amount of success. But what's important is I didn't actually think of myself being that particularly good. But what I did think I did well is I thought I was musically communicative. But as a person in my teens, I was a shy person. And this enormous extrovert, Gregor Piatigorsky, I found incredibly intimidating. So he would try to stimulate our imagination in every way possible. He cared more about a statement of conviction than whether what one was doing interpretively was correct or traditional or anything such as that. He did have his own aesthetic, though, that he pushed on us. I remember he used to say, the greater the composer, the less you have to do, and the poorer the composer, the more you have to do. So I'm not sure I ever completely bought into that, but I think he was basically saying, if it's a great work of art, don't ruin it. Yeah. He talked about being larger in life, and one of his favorite phrases was address the world. It was this idea of exaggeration, that the stage needed exaggeration. So he talked a lot about playing softer and softer and softer, or louder and louder and louder, which he said was the equivalent of a painter with more colors in his palette. He was brilliant at playing and teaching bow distribution also, and painting colors with bow speed. After that, not after that. So another cool moment in my life. By the way, let me just stop and say, I'm doing a lot of talking. I'll probably talk another 5 or 6 minutes, but I hope you're sort of keeping track of the artists that you're interested in, or maybe even if you have technical problems on the instrument, or you want somebody's ideas, if you want my ideas, or you want a particular artist's ideas. I'm looking forward to lots of questions. I want to talk just a few more minutes about each of my teachers, but please be putting together. You can be sending the questions in now to Will Suh, a brilliant cellist who happens to be our IT guy on Cello Bello here. Will ask, he's going to read questions to me in just a few minutes, so you can actually start sending them in now. And Will, if you want to interrupt me, if anything pertinent has come in that you'd like me to answer before I go further.
Sure, yeah. We have a question from Gabriel asking, hello, Professor Katz. I'm curious, who would you say was the most influential to your sound and right arm technique and expression?
Okay. Yes, I would love to talk about that. The answer is Leonard Rose, and I am coming to him in just a couple of minutes. But that's a very good. That's a very important question, and it was the lessons that I had with Rose were important to me. As I said before, I had a bow arm that was kind of mushy and undisciplined, and I think I always had a pretty good natural sound, but there was so much that was not organized in my bow arm, and Leonard Rose was an enormous help when it came to that. I'll come back to that, Gabriel. Don't worry, I'll talk about that in just a second. Anything else, Will, right now?
Yeah, there's another question from David. He asked, how did Piatigorsky teach vibrato, especially since his was so fast by today's standards? Also,
yeah.
Did you ever hear accounts of the great composers he worked with, Bloch, Strauss, Walton, etc.?
What was that about the great composers?
Did you ever hear accounts of the great composers he worked with, such as Bloch, Strauss, Walton, etc.?
Yes. I mean, when you're with Piatigorsky 10 hours a week for a couple of years, you hear stories about everything. And so whether I can pull those up out of my memory right now, I'm not exactly sure. I remember stories about Szigeti, the violinist. I remember stories about Thomas Beecham, who he recorded. I believe Beecham was the conductor for Shlomo. I don't remember specifically anything. I remember stories about Dunas. They were very interesting. I think he owes a lot of his pedagogical thinking to Dunas. And the curious thing is, I kind of have not gotten used to this. At the time that I was studying with Piatigorsky, I was not aware that his vibrato was so quick. I think it's interesting how, as one goes through generations that of playing, that tastes change somehow with the times. I mean, Piatigorsky is my hero, but when I hear him now, I cannot quite get that fast vibrato out of my brain. It's sort of, I'm noticing it all of the time. Where when I was a student, I don't think I was particularly aware of it, and I do remember. I can tell you a little bit about what that I learned from Piatigorsky in terms of vibrato. He pointed out that if you want to slow your vibrato down, if you open your hand so that there's more air between your fingers, that will slow the pulsation down. If you want a faster vibrato, then you bring your fingers together and compact the hand. And Piatigorsky, I think, played in this slanted position, although I don't particularly remember him talking about it. But I think it's one of the reasons that he had that incredibly fast pulsation. There's one other thing that I could really be wrong about this, but it's just something that I think I've noticed over the decades of watching cellists play. I think it has to do, we have different kinds of neurological responses. Like, as I said earlier, my own natural vibrato when I was a kid, I always felt was too slow and wobbly. So when I turned my hand on my side, I found a vibrato that worked for me. I've noticed that cellists that have incredibly fast vibratos usually have very good up-bow staccatos as well. That's just an observation that could be challenged and may not hold water, but I think it does have maybe something to do with the speed of the reflex. My wife, hope she doesn't kill me for this. My wife, Pei-Shan Lee, who's a wonderful pianist, a few years ago, I bought her as a present this DNA sampling 23andMe, where you send in your DNA and you get all of this. And Pei-Shan is incredibly fast. She's got just fingers that go all over and her sight reading ability is amazing. And so everything works really quickly for her. And when she got back her DNA sampling from 23andMe, I remember the quote. It says that she has fast twitch muscles like an elite athlete. So I thought, boy, that's really right on. So I think there must be something to, I don't know much more about it than that, but there must be something about twitching because they called it fast twitch. I guess a fast impulse that kind of varies, within the human race. And that's probably why some people run faster than others and some people can play faster than others. That's all I know about that. Okay, should I go on a little bit? Should I go to talk about Casals for a second?
There's a couple more questions if you want.
Oh, yeah,
to answer that.
sure.
Yeah. Arsted asks, did any of your teachers talk about going on the left or right sides of the string?
Yes. Oh, that's Aristides. Hi, how are you? Thank you for being here today. Actually, Victor Caesar talked about that when I was in high school. That was the first time that I heard about it. I believe that Leonard Rose talked about it, but I cannot be sure of that. I will talk about what I'm sure of with Rose, but I think that he also did talk about that. Yes.
Okay. And Hayden asks, were there any major disagreements between your teachers? And if so, what were they? How did you decide who to listen to?
Well, the trick to that, Hayden, hello, Hayden. The trick to that is not to study with two people at the same time. So, of course, there were disagreements in the sense that, like I just said, some people taught squared off, some people taught angled, some people taught high wrists, some people taught low wrists, but one was following the other. And I think what has really informed me as a teacher is that I think I was pretty good at absorbing all of that stuff. I tried to make it work at the time. I listened to what my teachers said, and I paid attention because I had such enormous respect for each of them. They were all so wonderful. So they tell me something, I would try and learn it. As you go on through life as a cellist, certain things you decide for yourself, this or that works better, so you discard certain things because you feel that a different approach is more natural to your own body. But I have to tell an anecdote that there was one sort of smashing difference between two giants that but neither of them knew they were interfering with each other, and it just turned out to be a lifelong lesson for me. When I was studying with Piatigorsky in 1962, this was a year that Pablo Casals, I was studying with Piatigorsky in Los Angeles in Southern California, and Pablo Casals came to Berkeley in Northern California to give a couple of weeks of master classes. And of course, I wanted to study with Pablo Casals if I possibly could. So I sent in a tape and I got accepted into the class. So there was one little problem, and that is that the Piatigorsky classes were going on at the same time. And I was afraid to tell Piatigorsky that I wanted to go up and study with Casals because I knew that there was a certain amount of jealousy or competitiveness there, and I wasn't really sure how he would take it. So instead, I guess I faked it. I told him I got sick, and then I went up to the Casals master class. Well, at the time I was studying the E-flat suite with Piatigorsky, and so I decided that I would play that for Casals. So anyway, that was a real lesson in culture shock. There was nothing about the fourth sweet prelude between Gregor Piatigorsky and Pablo Casals that was remotely related. And the part that got to me the most was how they heard intonation so differently. So this is a long conversation. Some of you may understand this, some of you may not, but I don't think I can explain it completely fully today. But Piatigorsky heard like the E-flat chords harmonically. In other words, when he would play an E-flat on the C string, the first note of the prelude, he would play it as a third against his open G string, and that's the E-flat that he would use. So that E-flat is, when you do that, that forces the E-flat to be a little bit higher. Now, the other way to hear an E-flat is to hear it as, if you hear D natural, the open D string, as a leading tone, you would then play a lower E-flat so that you squeeze the 7th and the 8th degrees, the leading tone being closer to the tonic. So that's the way Casals heard the key of E-flat. So in my way of, I do an hour and a half lecture on this, so I'm not going to go into it right now, but there's a difference in the way we tune one note following the next, or a way we can tune the same notes played in a chord vertically. So I often talk about vertically conceived intonation and melodically conceived intonation. So Piatigorsky was using vertically conceived intonation. He tuned his E-flat against a G, the open G string. Casals was using what I would call melodically conceived intonation, which is the way Casals taught intonation also, that he called it expressive intonation, where leading tones are close together, minor thirds are low, augmented seconds are wide. This is what we call expressive intonation, and I think it was extremely common when I was growing up, and certainly in the time, the generations before me. I think that kind of intonation, it's another thing that's changed, not entirely today. There are certainly people that play that way, but with chord tuners now, people are playing more tempered. They're not playing close half steps and wide augmented seconds quite to the extent that they used to. Close half steps, all of those things are melodically conceived. When you tune against when you use a tuner to base your intonation, or when you practice against a pedal, you eliminate all of that. So, but my lesson in that, I was stunned. I thought, how can these two great artists, the two great giants of my lifetime, Gregor Piatigorsky and Pablo Casals, not agree on how to play a note and tune together? And so what I learned from that is that there's so much subjectivity in intonation. And so what's important about intonation is that you have a strong conception of what you want, what you think is in tune and out of tune, and that you are consistent with it. If either one of them were mixing the high E-flats and the low E-flats, that wouldn't work. So anyway, probably enough on that topic for today, because there's so many things to talk about, but I just thought that would be an interesting story, and I hope that helps you a little bit, Hayden.
There's one more question from Diana asking, what was the one thing that completely changed your sound, and who was the teacher?
I don't think there's anything that completely changed my sound. I think sound is evolutionary. I think, it's all the other cellists you hear in your life, all the things that your teachers tell you, the fast vibratos, the slow vibratos, the flatandos, and the deep sounds, everything that one hears growing up, I think kind of goes into the mix. And so I must say that by instinct, I always liked a really big, deep sound with a lot of bottom. That's what I loved when I was a kid. So a name that I didn't study with, although I did play concerts with her, Zara Nelsova. Some of you may know that name. This was a woman that had a huge sound, and she got right down on the bridge, and she sustained everything big time. And I just loved that sound. I went to her recitals, and I wanted to play like Zara Nelsova. Later on, when I got to Greenhouse, who was a colorist and was very much more into shaping, he made a huge difference to me. So Greenhouse and Starker talked to me, and my years at Marlborough with members of the Budapest Quartet, all of these people talk so much about colors and different vibrato speeds and different vibrato widths. All of those people affected my sense of sound, and who knows where it comes from after a while. It all goes together, but and then I guess it becomes whoever you are. And I remember an interview with when I interviewed Bernie Greenhouse when he was 92 years old. I actually think that that interview segment might be on Cello Bello. If you go to the legacy section for Greenhouse, I think it's there. I remember him saying that when he teaches a person, his intention is not to make that person sound like him. It's to help them find their own voice. That's entirely the way I think about teaching. That I sort of pride myself in my own teaching that all of my students can sound different. So each student needs to find their own voice, their own conviction, what's natural to them. And that's what because there's so many different kinds of beautiful cello sounds. The one more thing I will say about that is that certainly in my formative years when I was a student, a beautiful sound was much, much more a value and a priority than it is today. It's not that people don't want to have a beautiful sound, but I actually think it's one of the real sort of negatives of YouTube and listening to music through earbuds and this type of thing. Sounds tend to get sort of equalized in a way. People sound, first of all, the thickness and the warmth, the natural bloom of a sound is so much lost when you're listening on earbuds or through a computer speaker or something such as that. So I think that there's a lot of pluses. Today's generation of musicians plays better in tune than my generation of musicians, because you've got all of those wonderful YouTube and CDs and things that you listen to, which I think has increased the standard of listening in terms of intonation. But I think in terms of sound and color and variety, I think a lot of that has been lost. And to me, that's a real pity, because what is it that people love about the cello first? Ask anybody, a lay person, why do you love the cello? And say, oh, I love the sound of the cello. That's what it's all about. Okay.
There's another question from Yunwen.
Hi, Yunwen.
Hi, PK. Did you envision how your teachers would play to help your practice? And would the person in your head change according to the music you were working on? Or would you mostly envision yourself? Or was that constantly changing throughout the years?
I think it changes all of the time. My teachers could play something for me and I could secretly say to myself, I don't want to sound like that, you know. But I remember Gabor Raito, who, I was very young. I started college when I was 16, and I remember coming into his class, and he played a few phrases for me in my freshman year. And I remember once I just was so despondent, and I said, Mr. Raito, that was so beautiful. I will never be able to sound like that. And he just laughed at me, and he said, of course you will. So yes, there are times when your teachers can play for you and it can be entirely inspirational. There's a famous Piatigorsky story. He said he was teaching a student at Curtis once, and he noticed he was trying to inspire the student to play a phrase better and better. And so whenever the student would play, and then Piatigorsky would say, no, not like that. And he would pick up his cello and he would play the most incredible phrase for the student. And the student would kind of shrink and sort of get intimidated by that. And so Piatigorsky picked up on that. And so he says that one day the student played a phrase for him, and Piatigorsky says, no, not like that. And he picked up the cello and he played it badly on purpose. And the student said, oh, yes, okay, Mr. Piatigorsky, and then felt liberated and free, and then played better than ever. So, yeah, there are different ways. I'm very good at that. I can sound terrible, and then I inspire my students that way, especially these days. Yeah.
Asher asks, did any of the teachers you mentioned teach you something you would not teach your students today?
Absolutely. Yes, of course. Yeah, I don't really believe in this high risk. Actually, I do when one's playing piano or pianissimo. So Asher is a student of mine, so he will know when I talk about lifting your weight off the cello and playing weightless on top of the cello like a pianissimo flautando or something like that. Your hand looks like this. But I don't believe in trying to play loud and pushing down on it this way. I believe in releasing weight and resting down into the instrument. I think that's how one goes deeper and under the string. And for that, when the weight of your arm is released, then the fingers give under that. So when one's playing loud, the wrist is flatter when one plays. So that's what I teach. And not everybody plays cello that way. And that's what I believe, so that's what I teach. But I also have to say that there are incredible cellists in the world that don't play that way. So there is more than one way to play the instrument. And there are times when I will get a student, particularly a graduate student coming in, could be a beautiful cellist, and maybe their technique is just different than what I teach. So I try and in that case, I will take the attitude, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So I think there are times that you have to tune into your student and find their individuality. Everybody's a little bit different, and you help them find what works. So I think the worst thing is to get overly rigid, overly dogmatic about your beliefs. You have your beliefs, you know what you feel works, you have the principles behind it, that feel logical and right to you. But there's so many different body types. People have had training before they come into my studio. So one just needs to be flexible and open-minded all the time. I think that's the only way to respond to the person in front of you.
There's a comment from Diana saying, your interview with Greenhouse was great for me when I was starting to learn Song of the Birds. Thank you.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
There's a question from Petro saying, great to see you and what a pleasure to listen to you. Which of these legendary teachers gave you the most freedom and space in your vision? And on the contrary, who was the most stubborn?
Hi, Petro. Petro is a Ukrainian cellist. We made our Ukrainian video together. Last time I talked to him, he was in Norway. I don't know where you are today, but hi, and thank you for being here. Piatigorsky was opening me up. That's what it was all about. That's what it was for everybody. He, as I said before, he was into making us whatever we felt, he wanted us to do more of it. And he used to, it's a cliche you hear all of the time, but it's true. He would always talk about an actor that goes on stage. You know, there's more rouge on the cheeks, the eyebrow liner is a lot thicker, the lipstick is painted on. If you walk down the street that way and visited with a friend, you look ridiculous. But when you're on the stage as an actor, it looks normal from the audience. So that was the analogy that he used in terms of exaggeration. And I believe in that. And as I said, also, I guess people don't believe me when I tell them today that I was shy, but I really was shy when I was a kid. And I was intimidated by Piatigorsky, and I was shy in the class. And probably he could sense that. I'm sure he could. So he did everything he could just to bust me open. And he helped me enormously with that. And even what I wasn't able to do in front of him, those were values that were instilled in me. So when I began a concert career with the Cleveland Quartet, I mean, that was very definitely something I took on stage with me every night. Just communicative intent, reach your audience, say it with conviction. Whatever you feel, say it more. In terms of rigidity, the other half of Petro's question, it's interesting. You know, I think a lot of us speak about how teaching has changed and how autocratic teachers used to be, wrap the knuckles and insult and all of that sort of thing. And there certainly was plenty of that teaching, but it's interesting. None of my cello teachers were really that way. Gabor was probably the most rigid in terms of the way he liked to hear music. He liked to hear music the way he liked to hear it. He heard the phrase the way he heard it. Casals was the same thing, but they were both warm, wonderful, supportive human beings. They didn't beat up on their students, so not rigid in that way. So even 60 years ago, the people that I was studying with were very supportive teachers, I have to say. I always felt that. Piatigorsky's class was really tough for me because Piatigorsky had a great sense of humor, and unfortunately, the person playing for him was often the butt of his jokes. So that hurt, especially because I was intimidated. So I was always very nervous in Piatigorsky's class. But it was all in the spirit of good fun and supportive in a way. And Piatigorsky was, at the same time, he was really very much a father figure and a very warm, wonderful man. So there was a bit of mix there.
There's another question from Felipe asking, dear professor, I've seen young students that don't know recordings from legendary cellists. Sometimes their excuse is that they don't want to listen to them to not mess up their own interpretation. Well, what do you think of this?
Yeah, that's something that musicians talk a lot about. I actually think that the way one grows is to listen to as much music as possible. I'm really big on live concerts, and there's unfortunately less of that today because the whole world of music's available on YouTube. But you can learn a lot from YouTube. You can watch, you can listen. As I said, there's certain aspects of sound production that are lost on a computer, but there's still so much you can learn. But I encourage my students to go to live concerts whenever possible. I think the only danger in listening to recordings is if you have your favorite recording and you play it 100 times and you never listen to anything else. I can imagine for some people that could turn out to be a negative. However, if you are listening to a Bach cello suite and you listen to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 performances, you'll like some and you won't like some, and maybe you won't even know why you like some and why you don't like some, but or you hear something you like, so you go to your cello and you try it. You hear something you don't like, so I think that's the learning process. So when I teach, what I really believe is that, here's a Piatigorsky quote, which I say all of the time. Piatigorsky will always say, the fingers have no brains and the fingers have no ears. So, which means you just can't let your fingers play. They need guidance, right? So where I'm going with that right now is ears. So you're only as good as your ears. That's one of my sayings. You're only as good as your ears, which means up here between those ears, there is a conception of what the cello sounds like. There's a conception about who you are as a performer. There's a conception of the composer that you're playing, of the work that you're playing. All of that tumbles around as you study and a piece evolves and you make decisions. You're going to go faster here, you're going to go slower here, you want a slow vibrato, you want a fast vibrato, you want a fast bow, whatever it is. There's a myriad of things that they're infinite. So how does one make those decisions as to what to do? The way you make those decisions is what your ears are hearing and when are they happy and when are they not happy. So the more developed your inner world is up here, the better player you're going to be. So, and in that respect, I think listening to all the cellists that you can listen to, and all the performances you can listen to, and all the violinists you can listen to, and all of the leader singers you can listen to. I mean, it's endless, but that's how we get a conception of art and taste and style and everything else. So I don't think one should be at all afraid of listening. Not at all. I better push on or we will never get through my other heroes. I love them. I don't want to leave them out.
Yeah, just one comment from Nancy Lubin saying, "This is totally wonderful. Thank you so much. Can't believe I played for you today."
Hi, Nancy. Yes, I saw Nancy this morning, and she played for me, and she has improved a lot. Bravo, Nancy. um, so I can probably, I'll come back to Casals. He was not one of my major teachers, and I already talked about him a little bit. So let me go on to Greenhouse right now. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree with Piatigorsky, I wanted to keep studying with Piatigorsky, and I had only studied with him for 1 year. But the other part of me was I had always planned on going to New York after I graduated from college. I mean, this was 1961, 62 in California. Airplanes weren't, especially since my parents didn't have a lot of money, people didn't fly around a lot like they did today. So I had never been east. There was this huge attraction of New York. I'd only been on one airplane flight in my life, and that was just up to San Francisco. So the idea of leaving home and striking out on my own, that pull really got to me. And Bernard Greenhouse had come and played a couple of concerts in Los Angeles that year, one with the Beaux-Arts Trio and another with a fantastic group called the Bach Aria Group that some of you might know. And talk about sound. I was so in love with his cello sound. I had never heard such a beautiful cello sound before, and I just decided that I wanted to study with him. So after his concert with the Beaux-Arts Trio, I went backstage and I introduced myself to him. And of course, I had the magic intro card. All I had to say was that I was a student of Piatigorsky. As soon as I said that, bang, he was interested in me. Had no idea how I played. But anyway, Greenhouse was really a warm man. He was fantastic. And he says, "Oh, why don't you come to my hotel room the next morning and play for me?" And I went and I took a lesson and I loved it. So I wound up going to New York and getting my master's degree with him. So what he was really fantastic at in his own playing, and he tried to teach it as well, was variety of vibrato. He had 3 different vibratos. He had a finger vibrato right in the fingertip. He had a wrist vibrato. He would break his wrist down and vibrate this way. And then he had the forearm vibrato here, which is probably the most ubiquitous and maybe the fundamentally the most important vibrato that you begin with. So he worked with me on those things. He was an impeccable player. He had extremely high artistic standards in terms of phrase shaping, etc. And the other thing that he really helped me with was he was the one that taught me a lot about anticipation of shifts, anticipation of motions in general, not making a fast shift, but starting the shift earlier so that one could control where you arrive. If you go quickly, I have a Dorothy DeLay quote, the great violin pedagogue. She would always say that a fast shift is like driving down the street 100 miles an hour and trying to get into a tight parking space. And she would shake her finger and she said, "You might make it, but you might have an accident." So I use that a lot, and that's exactly what Greenhouse was teaching also. Shift at a speed where you can guide the hand, don't exceed the speed limit so that you can stop exactly where you want to, and instead of you lose control when you go too fast. Same thing with string crossings. Prepare your string crossings. Don't make fast string crossings at the last moment. That ruins your legato. So he worked a lot with me on that sort of thing. And I owe him a tremendous amount. And we became real buddies in later years. He had his his instrument was the Paganini Stradivarius that Paganini owned. And when my Cleveland Quartet gained some celebrity, the Corcoran Gallery of Art in the 1980s had a whole quartet of instruments that belonged to Paganini, the four Paganini Strads, and they gave those, the two violins, viola. The viola is what the instrument that Harold in Italy was written for. Two violins, viola, and cello. They gave them to the Cleveland Quartet, and we played them for 10 years. So, and it was during these 10 years that we invited Greenhouse to, well, he recorded with us. We recorded 2 Brahms sextets with him and Pinky Zuckerman, but we also played a number of Schubert quintets with Greenhouse. And he told me at the time, he said, that the cello that he was playing, the Paganini Strad that he was playing, was the original cello in the quartet. And for some reason, Paganini didn't think it fit, so he sold it, and he bought the Paganini Strad that I was playing. So we loved the fact that these 5 Paganini instruments would go out on stage together and play. The truth is, I don't know why Paganini did that, because Greenhouse's Strad was greater than the Strad that I was playing. Greenhouse's Strad was one of the more magnificent instruments of the world. And the one that I was playing, which was an incredible A string and a very beautiful cello, but Stradivarius made it when he was 92 years old, and I think he might have lost a step by that anyway. It was not one of his very greatest instruments. And then after Greenhouse, I got 2 more to go, folks. If you hang in there with me, I got to study with Leonard Rose. He's the guy that fixed my bow arm, and there is a wonderful video of Leonard Rose. You can find it on YouTube, or you can find it in the Legacy section on Cello Bello under Leonard Rose, of Rose sitting in front of a camera for 15 or 20 minutes and just talking about bow arm. And I love that video. It's sort of a video which is shows the personality of the times. It's a little bit stiff and a little bit formal. That's the way people were in those days. Here I am sitting in a sweatshirt, laid back in a chair. I mean, that didn't happen back then. But there's so much. I would urge everybody, if you're interested in bow arm and beautiful sound and thick sound, to watch that Leonard Rose video. It's easy to find. So Rose took his bow arm from Ivan Galamian. So I studied with Rose at Meadowmount, which I think probably most of you know was the violin mecca of the world. When I was at Meadowmount, that's where I met Itzhak Perlman and Pinky Zuckerman, who were teenagers, along with me. We were all teenagers together. Kyung-Hwa Chung, incredible Korean violinist, was there. Young-Uk Kim was there. Donald Weilerstein, who became the first violinist of the Cleveland Quartet with me. These were the violin legends. We were all students there together. And Galamian had a very specific way of teaching the bow, which had to do with these collet exercises, bending and straightening the fingers, crawling out on the bow, crawling back on the bow, waving, getting flexibility in your hand, breaking your bow grip so that you're not in a death grip, but so that having the bow balanced in your hand and flexible in your hand replaces muscling it, right? Which is, when you muscle it, you lose nuance, you lose sensitivity. And Rose, with those Galamian Galamian exercises and all of the exercises that he taught me about bow changes and things, he took this kind of floppy kid that couldn't control it, and he taught me to control all of these motions. And so back to an earlier question before, I think it was Rose. Rose was also very much into arm weight and releasing, which I did not hear so much from Raito or Starker. Piatigorsky played that way, but didn't talk about it so much. Piatigorsky did talk about it. Piatigorsky had a phrase, which I also use in my teaching. He would say, cello playing is dropping all of your weight into the cello and picking all of your weight off of the cello. And then he would smile and say, and everything in between. So that's the way he talked about making dynamics and colors, which, as I say, Piatigorsky was always so colorful. And then lastly, Starker, who's maybe better known to everybody watching because he lived the latest. I think Starker died in 2013. I can't believe that it's almost 10 years now since he died. But of course, what a unbelievable legacy he left, not as only as a player, but as a great pedagogue. So Starker talked about music quite a bit, but not so much things like tempo and phrasing as some other teachers. He had certain aspects of musical taste that he really cared about. He didn't like heavy shifts and slides and thick, gooey sounds. I remember once he picked up the cello and he picked up the cello and did an imitation of Rostropovich. And so what struck me at the time was, oh my God, Janos, why don't you just play like that? Because, I mean, I loved the sound when he was making fun of Rostropovich, but it was so rich and so much bottom and everything. And of course, that's the sound that I loved. And Starker was a much more agile, lighter player, which of course made him maybe I don't know if it's still the same with Yo-Yo now, but at the time, Starker was the most recorded cellist of all time. He sounded amazing on recordings. He was light and he was facile, he was brilliant, and all of these little subtleties of nuance and everything that he played were picked up by the microphone. They were totally amazing. And when you would go and hear him in a concert hall, sometimes he was more difficult to hear than other cellists because he did not have a big sound, but because it wasn't his intention to have a big sound. That was not a value that he had. He could do anything that he wanted on the instrument. He gave me a left-handed compliment, which bothers me to this day because I don't know how much of a compliment it was, but I think it was the first time I ever played for him. I finished a Bach prelude and he looked at me and he said, I only know one other cellist in the world that can play so beautifully and is so god-awful tight. And the person that he mentioned was Frank Miller, who is a cellist that I never met, but I think Frank Miller was the principal cellist of the NBC Symphony with Toscanini, and I believe also principal cellist of the Chicago Symphony. Great big man, 300 and something pounds, something like that, and I never met him, so it was a compliment but I took it to heart. And it's funny that when I look back on that, I don't understand that because I had always been kind of loose and floppy and I always had soft hands and I didn't think of myself as tight. But he worked on me and I'm sure he was right. Of course, Janos Starker was right. And so I owe him a lot. There were a tremendous number of similarities between Greenhouse and Starker. All of the left hand, the transferring of weight from finger to finger and releasing the old finger, preparation of shifts, playing in a slanted position. All of those things were taught commonly by Greenhouse and Starker, and since I studied with them side by side, that was kind of seamless for me, and one of them reinforced the other. Okay, I spoke a lot. We've gone a little bit late. If there's more questions, I'm glad to hang around for a while.
Sure. There's a question from Jennifer. A question from a 9-year-old cellist. What is something that you wished that you knew about how to practice that you didn't learn until you were older?
So many things. You know, that is such a great question. Learning how to practice is really hard. So I think lots of my life when I was a kid, I didn't know how to practice. I didn't know how to get better. So a lot of times when I'm teaching, I will actually practice a passage. I'll have so what I would say, I don't know the name of the 9-year-old, but thank you for the question. And I would say you should ask your teacher, how can I practice this? Say, how come I sound scratchy? How can I practice it? Or I can't get this in tune. Can you give me some ideas or something like that? Teachers usually like that when a student asks them questions, because it means that the student is trying and needs some answers, and that's what teachers are for. So yes, don't worry if you don't have an answer to something that you're trying to do. You just the other thing that Piatigorsky talked about all the time, which actually would be good advice now. Piatigorsky talked about good practicing needs to be experimental. Don't just keep doing something over and over again until you think you will get it. You try it in this part of the bow, try it in that part of the bow, try it with a different finger. Anything that you can think of, change the bowings. If it's all separate notes, practice it slurred. If it's slurred, practice it all separate notes. All kinds of different things that you make up, and you will learn. You'll practice it another way, and maybe you'll bomb out and it didn't help at all. Or you'll practice it another way and, oh my gosh, that worked. And then you've learned something about practicing that can help you for the rest of your life. So be curious and be experimental and ask lots of questions, and it will make you a better practicer.
We got another question from Musica Angela saying, can you describe what Greenhouse's sounded like close up live?
Gorgeous. Yeah. Greenhouse was a cellist that sounded very beautiful under the ear. Of course, he had a Stradivarius. And just to be that close to a great instrument was amazing. I mean, I got to play I have a Honorary now, and I had a Stradivari for 10 years that I played, but not at that point in my life, not when I was 20, 21 years old, and I got to listen to that instrument a lot. So I think because the sound was so beautiful, he kind of got me away from this thing about just playing loud and sustained all of the time. I think one does need to know how to play loud and sustained. You need to know how to make a big sound, and need to know how to play sostenuto, particularly when you're playing Brahms or Shlomo or something such as that. But the variety of his vibrato and colors, and even the way he shifted his contact point up and down the string, that was very inspirational to me, I have to say.
We have a comment from Ernesto saying, the first CD of classical music I ever bought was one of the Cleveland Quartets, and that made me fall in love with the cello. Such a pleasure to be here.
Oh, wow, that gave me goosebumps. Thank you so much. What a nice compliment.
We have a question from Tord saying, a bit of an unrelated question, but what is your view on the Gerhard Mantel book, Cello Technique, Principles and Forms of Movement?
Okay, Gerhard Mantel. Yes, that book had a big impression on me. You know what it taught me? It taught me that I never wanted to write a book on cello technique. That's, it's a really good book, but I think what it taught me is that it's impossible to write a book about cello technique. First of all, it's so dry that to wade through those descriptions takes an enormous amount of patience. And in the end, I don't. So, this is goes to, in a way, to people sometimes ask me, how did Cello Bello get started? So, back around 2004, 2005, a cellist that knew, not my student, but a cellist that knew me, was going to Harvard to get her PhD, and she called me up one day and she said that she wanted to write her PhD dissertation on my teaching and my studio. And basically the thrust of her dissertation was going to be how we mentor, how we pass the art form down, not by books, but we pass it through the generations by one-on-one teaching, one-on-one mentoring, and that's how the art form is passed down. So she wrote a really wonderful dissertation, 250 pages. She was in my studio for 2 or 3 years, interviewed my students, interviewed me, took me apart, put me back together, and she wrote something that I learned a lot about myself from that. And then when it was finished, she approached me and she said, I'd like to make this a book. And I said to her, Elizabeth, I'm very flattered and I would love to do something like that too, but I just don't believe in books for teaching. There's too many things that can get mixed up. And I'll just divert from the story for 1 second. When I was a young teacher, my first job, I was 22, I got my first job at the University of Toledo, and the violin teacher on the faculty came to me one day and said, "Oh, Mr. Katz, we're going to get along so well because you're a Leonard Rose student and I'm an Ivan Galamian student." And she asked me to come and watch her teach. So I went and went and watched a Suzuki class she sat on a Saturday morning, and I walked in there with a whole bunch of young violinists doing this. And this was the figure 8, if you could see it. I'm making a figure 8. In the Galamian book on bowing, he draws a figure 8 and shows that this is the feeling of, and that's how you keep the bow straight on a violin. You track it, something like that. Well, she exaggerated that so far. So I said to her, I said, Lorraine, I said, did you learn that from Galamian? Because I was sort of in shock to see these little kids. And she said, well, yes, not exactly. I never really studied with him, but I got it out of his book. So that's what I mean about taking something that's on the printed page and trying to understand it. You can pick up tips, but I don't think there's that much you can learn. And that's nothing against Gerhard Mantel. There's amazing insight in that book, but it's so easy to be misunderstood. So anyway, to finish my Cello Bello story, I turned down the idea of a book, but we decided that maybe we could make a DVD. DVDs were a big deal in 2005. And the idea was, this was my idea, I said, if you can see it and you can hear it, that's a huge difference. Then it's still not the same as hands-on in the room, but if you can see it and hear it, less chance of being misunderstood. Anyway, it's a long story, but out of that came Cello Bello and the website. So the idea of a DVD slowly morphed into a website, and cello lessons, which you can see and which you can hear, and supplementary text that you can read. But I think it's the whole thing together. So that's why I'm not a big fan of the Gerhard Mantel book, except for maybe adult teachers that have not for kids, not growing up. No, I don't think it works. Yeah.
We have a comment from Frank saying, "This is amazing. So many gems, and these stories are legendary." We have another question from Kristen saying, "Many great cellists play into their 80s. In my 60s, my hands get tired, yet are still full of creative energy." I think she's asking for any tips or advice.
Well, yes, I have to say I'm a few weeks away from my 81st birthday, and I'm not really playing the cello anymore. So I kind of know where you're coming from. We all, the body changes as we get older. Some of us are blessed and able to play 80s and 90s, and others have to stop earlier. In my case, I had a couple of falls. So when I fell, I tore rotator cuffs, and so it's hard for me to get my arms up. So that's basically and it also has so much to do with your earlier training. If you're 60 years old and you've been playing, let's say, with a lot of tension in your hands all of your life, that tension, that accumulative tension, could be causing you problems and maybe shorten your productive years. And as you get older and those habits get very ingrained, it's harder to let go. But basically what you need to do is, it's like as we get older, at least what's helped me a lot is stretching, doing easy yoga and stuff such as that, just because the body tends to get stiffer and tighter, whether it's cello or anything else. So I think, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but it was beautiful the way you phrased the question. There was that your hands don't want to do it anymore, but you haven't lost your passion for playing. I think you said something to that effect. Of course, I feel that. So I'm able to satisfy that because I have wonderful students and I teach them and I hear them. And so I'm still in music and I'm still in the repertoire. And I feel fulfilled in that way. It was hard as hell to decide I wasn't going to go back on stage and play any more concerts. And I can imagine that you're feeling that too. It's the hardest kind of decision one ever has to make. But keep playing for fun at home. And as long as it's not, if it's creating pain in your body, then you have to make a decision. Going for massages, doing yoga, finding things for flexibility, and to the extent you can, examining your habits and making sure that you are as loose. Oh, here's a Starker quote, which at 60 years old may be of minimal help, but maybe not. Starker told me when he was in his 70s, we were having a meal together, and he said, "My lifetime as a cellist, it was the evolutionary discovery and release of smaller and smaller points of physical tension." Like for one of the great cello virtuosos of all time, to be saying that in his 30s, his 40s, his 50s, his 60s, that he was still searching for more release of tension, because tension blocks mastery, tension blocks nuance, tension blocks a big sound too. When you're tight and you're muscling things, it's just not as efficient as dropping your weight in and being free. Tension blocks everything. It's our biggest enemy. And I hope it hasn't caught up with you and forced you to stop, but you can look back on the wonderful years that you've had. At some point, we've all got to stop. That's got to get philosophical about it. Yeah.
We have another question from Leonard saying, do you have any advice on how one can harmonize one's breath with the bow changes, especially while playing Bach?
Yeah, there's, get this Caesar book. There's really great breathing exercises in there. But you can, when I said about being experimental or creative in your practicing, I think almost anything that you do in a conscious way, for example, you can say, I'm going to breathe in on a down bow and out on an up bow. Or you can say, I'm going to breathe in and out on a down bow. Or I'm going to do it 3 times. You learn to control your breath. Just inventing things like that without hyperventilating. I can tie these last 2 questions together a little bit to the woman that was talking about tension. Nature's biggest release is the exhale. So if you're sitting in your chair listening to me right now and you just take a breath and go, you can feel your whole body release, right? If you are squeezing here and you exhale, as you exhale, you will find that you are able to let go of the grip much better than if you're holding your breath. So I teach my students, let's put it this way. When I was in my younger years, my teachers used to say, breathe, Paul, breathe. And I would breathe, and I was kind of a nervous cellist, so I would breathe by hold my breath and play, and then hold my breath and play again. So maybe that's why Starker thought I was tight. I know that I used to do stuff like that. So one day I had this revelation, which is a story that I won't take the time to tell now, but I did have a kumbaya moment. But that, if you're nervous and you take a breath and you're nervous, you can hold it for a long time. And then you take another breath. But the body will never forget to breathe in. It will only forget to breathe out. So I found this helped me more than in terms of controlling nerves on stage and being loose on stage and free on stage. I just taught myself to exhale. So Dvorak concerto, ba da da dam, I think the question was about Bach prelude. Ba da 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 da. So I would say forget about inhaling. Whatever you're doing in the Bach suites or in your cello playing, you come to the end of a phrase, exhale. It helps the body to release tension. It gets rid of tension in the hands. It gets rid of tension in the shoulders. It gets rid of tension everywhere. And if you exhale, you always have to take a breath. Nobody ever forgot to breathe in. So just concentrate on breathing out, and nature will take care of breathing in. And I think hopefully that will help you feel much more comfortable. And for the woman that was talking about being tight here, try that also and see if that can help you.
Frank has a question saying, being over 20 years since I've had a teacher, now revisiting repertoire I was once able to play, I find it difficult to know when I've got a passage or a piece down. How do I know when to move on and keep trucking?
There isn't any one answer to that. Progress is evolutionary. So, like an important part of practicing is to know thyself. There are people that are obsessive with taking a single bar and practicing it and practicing it and practicing it. And sometimes that works, and sometimes they're just digging their hole a little bit deeper that they're going to fall into. There are people that just play through everything all of the time and never get down to detail. So first thing you need to do is know about yourself. Am I a detail-oriented person? Am I a person that can get obsessive about something so that it becomes negative? Because there's a point where just practicing and practicing and practicing is like hitting your head against the wall, and it's not doing any good. So you have to have a sense of when is it productive and when is it not productive? When is it time to drop it and move on to something else? And playing through pieces, especially if you're going to perform, that's very important to do, but only playing through pieces and not actually knuckling down and fixing that shift that you miss every day, or a coordination problem that you have, or a scratch that you don't like. One has to, so practicing is a matter of balance, and it's when to perform for yourself, when to take a passage and work on it. If I'm going to work on this passage, how many different ways can I work on it? I like to think of, if your goal is up here at the top of the mountain and you're down at the bottom of the mountain and you're trying to learn this thing, and this, which is up here, you can go up a road to the top this way, you can go up a road and hit a dead end and have to come back down and start over again. You can take a road, make a right turn, and then go up. There's so many ways to get to the top. And what I mean by that is there's so many different ways to practice. Some of them will be helpful, some of them won't be helpful, but that's where what Piatigorsky was saying about being experimental. Just keep trying things. Try it faster, try it slower, try changing the rhythm, try playing louder, playing softer, try practicing it mentally. Don't move your hands and play it in your head. There's like a million ways to practice things, and keep looking for those and learning more and more of them, and it makes your practicing more efficient. And if you get up one day and the part about when should you keep on trucking, that's cute. I like that. You're going to keep on trucking whether you're still on the same passage or whether you're going on to something else, right? We're always trucking. But one of the biggest problems in practicing is too many people don't know why they're practicing. So you want to, and where that really comes down is, do you know what you want to hear? Is it in tune or out of tune? If you're not sure, then that means that your ear isn't sufficiently developed. So maybe you need to go to the piano to play it. Maybe you need to play it an octave lower where it's easier to get it in your ear. Maybe you need to take some of those notes and test them against open strings. So, but when you're playing something over and over and over again and you want to improve it, make sure you know what your goals are. Am I just playing this over and over and over? Or do I want to get it better in tune? Do I want to get the shape of the phrase better? Do I want to control my vibrato better? Am I getting stuck out at the frog? Do I need to get further out in the bow? There's like infinite number of things you can be teaching yourself. So just make sure that your practicing has purpose.
I think we'll take one more question and maybe wrap up. It's been an hour and a half, so.
Wow.
So I think there's a question from Rhonda asking, can you tell me more about the Paganini Strad that you played on? What did you like and what did you not like about it?
Sure. This was, my Guarneri, which is my baby sitting right over here to the side of me, has, I think, one of the greatest C strings in the world. It's just kind of has this enormous bass function. And I like dark sounds and I like thick, rich sounds. And that's why I fell in love with this cello, and that's why I picked it. And I also picked it because it just fits perfectly the function of a cello and a string quartet, where the cellist has to be the foundation. You want something massive on which the house can be built. Those two puny violins and the viola. So it's an ideal quartet cello. So it's probably not the greatest cello in the world for concertos, because the A string is very dark, and very, very dark instruments don't cut through like with an orchestra. The dark sounds tend to homogenize more. So when I got the Paganini Strad to play on, it was the opposite. Had the most gorgeous A string in the world. It was just so silky and creamy and smooth, and it just had a, kind of an A string sound that melts you. It was so beautiful. And then as I would go lower on the cello, I would miss the richness of the C string that I was used to on my Guarneri. So I often thought I could have the world's greatest cello if I could just figure out how to get these two instruments together and produce a new one. But haven't figured that out yet. The Strad. Another interesting thing, by the way, which I discovered, I found that when I got on the Strad, that intonation was more transparent. There was less room. The smallest little change on the Strad was like a very audible change in pitch, because the instrument was bright and singing. This cello, which at least maybe I'm just fooling myself, but I always still do feel when I'm playing this instrument that I have a little bit more room. The sonority itself is broad and wide. It's not as, this cello has edge in it for sure, but around the edge there's a lot of this. And with the Strad, it's a more direct sound. And so I found that really had to be really right there on the resonance, and that there was less room with the Strad. But of course, what a wealth of riches. I'm very privileged to have had those two instruments to play on those two incredible experiences. So I guess we probably should stop.
Yeah, I think we should wrap up. If you can give any closing
enjoyed
remarks.
This so much.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the questions, and of course, when you get to be 80 years old, it's always fun to reminisce. I hope I didn't bore you with all of that. I have a ton more stories where those come from. But you've been an amazing audience, and I hope I can do this again sometime soon. Thank you so much.